Welcome back to another one of my weird story videos. We're going to finish the story of my first time working in a kitchen, and why I'll never do it again. We mostly talked about the weird and awkward parts of working there in the last video, not necessarily good or bad things, so today we're diving into the more annoying things that came with the job. First off, we need to talk about the devil itself, literally Satan. And no, this is not a person. This was a little oven-like thing, called a Mary Chef. I'm not a tall guy. I admit that. I'm 5'8", and the bottom of this thing was placed at about upper chest height on me, and it had a door that opened downward. And I cannot tell you how many times I accidentally burned myself on the piece of shit. A kitchen is a fast-paced environment. I needed to be flinging food around from deep fryers, microwaves, actual ovens, the salad station, and this little demon. And having to reach up and in and over the top of the door at nearly shoulder height was awful. I got a really horrible burn one time where I actually had to go to the manager and ask for some burn ointment to alleviate it because it was getting so bad. I left a scar straight across my wrist. I hated and still hate that thing. It will make an appearance later in the story. For now, just know it gave me many, many burns. So, Boss Man's sister, the co-owner from last video, she hated her job. Hated it. And she took it out on the employees, especially the cooks. I'll go into a theory as to why in a little bit, but the important thing to know is that she was in charge of scheduling. And she was the one who fired the cleaning crew and made the cooks take over. So she'd show up some days in a bad mood and just decide something to annoy the cooks. Like she walked down the line, pulled out a garbage can which is tucked away under the counters, and no one ever sees them, and said, "This is disgusting, you have to clean them." So I had to spend the next hour and a half scrubbing clean the outside of every single garbage bin, which had never been cleaned before. Ever, and had years of food waste and grime caked on. In the middle of my shift as a cook, not a garbage scrubber. Then another day she walked out and said the ceiling was gross, and the cooks had to clean the ceiling. So we got a ladder, and the tallest cook, and they had to wipe down the ceiling. Again, in the middle of their shift. This wasn't even closing. Then she issued a statement that the cooks weren't wearing their uniforms and would be in big trouble if they didn't start wearing them because none of us were wearing our hats. I asked the cook who had worked there the longest. He had been there 5 years, and he said he forgot they even had hats. He had never worn his, and it was never a rule to wear it. And when I started, the owner, the scaredy bitch boy, said we could just wear hairnets and forget the hats, which is what all of us did. We weren't even allowed to be seen by the guests, so there was no reason to wear the hats with the restaurant's name on them. Then we get to the worst thing she'd do. She was in charge of the scheduling, but her brother was the one who would actually talk to the employees. A lot of people who worked there were working part-time as students in university and college, and they needed time off for their exams and stuff. So they would ask the scaredy boy owner, and he'd do as usual, "Yes, of course. I totally understand. We'll take care of that right away. Don't you worry one bit." Then his asshole sister would make sure to schedule them during their exams, just to be a dickhead. Everyone was pissed about it. She'd also just not schedule dishwashers for the morning, which usually the cooks again would need to pick up the slack. But on weekends we'd be busy all day, so it was really hard to cook and prep and do dishes all at once, with only 3 cooks covering 4 stations, struggling enough as it was. Then the servers would bitch about the dishes not being done fast enough. I'm also going to go into this. A lot of our dishwashers were hired from a program that helps people with disabilities get jobs, which is great. They were all super nice people, most of them gamers, so on slow days I'd actually hang out with the dishwashers, talking about Dark Souls and Call of Duty and shit. But a small issue was that some of them didn't have fully functioning motor skills. It was a lot more awkward and difficult for them to move around than other people. and the servers would still be getting bitchy and shitty about them taking too long. Like, bitch, you spend all day on your ass at the bar, staring at your phone. If you want the dishes done faster, roll up your sleeves and get scrubbing. I know it's not your job, but it's not mine either, and I had to do those dishes so goddamn often because they'd forget to schedule the dishwashers. Now, you might be thinking, wow, Noah is a really bitter ex-employee, and I'm going to take that thought and transition into the next problem. Bitter ex-employees. We'd have people quit, and then find shitty, petty ways to take it out on the restaurant. But instead of it affecting the piece of shit owners, it would just make life harder for the dishwashers and the cooks. Like, one guy quit and decided to be an asshole, so on our busiest day, he showed up 5 minutes before closing with 12 people. Because he knew we'd be forced to keep the kitchen open until they were all done and left. And then, after that, we'd have to shut things down, wait for stuff to cool, then do all the cleaning before we were allowed to go home. I think I was there until almost 1 a.m. that day. It sucked. Now we get into the annoying clique that started to form in the kitchen. So, the head of kitchen and this one dumb asshole piece of shit, who we will call Crapbag for the rest of this video, seemed to be besties. Crapbag was absurdly lazy, awful at his job, and I constantly had to clean up after his messes. Like, if I was the person replacing him for his shift, my first job would be fixing the last 2 orders that went out that he did because he fucked up and they were returned. Another cook who also hated him once sat with me and watched to see how long it would take for him to do the order at his station since we were both free at ours at the moment. We waited 12 entire minutes of him sitting there doing literally nothing, just leaning against the counter. Then the other cook said that order has to go out or we're gonna get in trouble, and did Crapbag's job for him, which was super common. Everyone always had to do Crapbag's job for him. But because he was buddy-buddy with the head of kitchen, and I was the newest employee, I'd always get blamed when he fucked up, or when he didn't do his job, as if it was me fucking up, or I was the one slacking off. I once actually got pissed off enough to yell at the head of kitchen for that bullshit, and she got too scared to talk to me for the rest of that shift. It was a very peaceful shift. They'd also often talk in a language that wasn't English, which seems fine at first, but then you'd see them pointing and gesturing at you. And I'd be like, I'm gonna throw hands. And they seemed like they actively conspired to make that job hell for me so they could get me to quit and hire more of their friends. Which I wasn't even the first person to quit and be replaced like that. They would straight up treat some employees like shit and purposely piss them off. It was awful. On my last day, I was asking the guy who worked there the longest about a lot of stuff the head of kitchen would ask me to do, and tell me it was my job, and bitch me out for. And he was super confused, and explained to me that none of that was ever my job, and she was absolutely just fucking with me to make my job worse. Another one of the assholes was literally always high, and I don't mean he took a puff in the cooler like a lot of employees and continued doing his job. No. The dude would drink, and he'd take his weed gummies during his shift and be too out of it to do his job at all. I once found him just standing in the cleaning closet after I thought he had already left and finished his shift, since he'd been gone so long. He was zoning in and out and giggling at nothing. I asked if he was okay, and his response was, I just took some more candies. And it turned out he was absolutely still on the clock. So, by the time I quit that job, we only had about 4 people who actually did their jobs out of all the cooks, and getting scheduled with any of the assholes who didn't would mean you had to do the work of 3 people to make up for it. I luckily had a favorite manager, super sweet, very nice, would often let me leave early if it was slow and I wasn't closing. She definitely was the only person who cared about the morale of the kitchen. I asked her if I could use her as a reference on my resume, and her response was, Noah, if you leave, we're so fucked. That was a month before I left. Oh, and while still on the topic of bad employees, one dude was super pervy and gross and would often say, "I'm so glad we don't have HR, or I would have been fired years ago." And was happy to tell people which server had blown him. And he very much liked to harass the servers. And now that I'm saying this out loud, I'm starting to think he was the reason the servers hated the cooks. Huh. Anyway, the main point of that story is that we didn't have human resources, and some people were happy to take advantage of that. Also, one of our dishwashers was sick of the scheduling not including them in the morning because of the colossal pile of dishes he would have to get through during the rush when he finally got scheduled to show up. So he came in a half hour early to get caught up on things before the evening rush started, and the owner straight up removed his time for that day. And when he asked why, they said it was because he came in when not scheduled, and when he tried to explain the situation to them, they just kept calling him a liar. Another dishwasher, one who quit, left a message on the group app explaining the poor treatment and absolute lack of teamwork from the servers and owners. And one of the owners just replied, "If anyone wants an example of how not to quit a job, here it is." And then later deleted her rant and his own response because honestly, his response was also super unprofessional. So, after all that, everything I've told you guys about, I kept getting really bad schedules. The 8 days in a row for my very first week started getting more common. Even when they weren't, I'd get my days off several days apart, so I barely had time to recuperate. I finally told the coward owner, "Look, I'm exhausted. I still have stuff to do at home. I can't keep doing these schedules. I need 2 days off in a row every week, like I'm supposed to have." And he said, "I totally get that. I understand 100%. It can be hard. That's entirely fair. We'll do that for you. Don't you worry." Then I got my schedule, and it was one that fucked me over again. I went from looking at that schedule directly to my computer. I had work in 3 hours. I wrote up my 2 weeks' notice, printed it out, and dropped it on his desk the second I got in that day. I was at my limit. I was done. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Maybe it was something pretty small, but with everything I'd been putting up with compiled, I decided it was time to leave. I talked to the one good manager and told her, "Hey, there's one thing I need to say about whoever replaces me. That merry chef from hell. It is in a horrible, horrible place. Whoever you hire, make sure they're at least taller than me, or you guys gotta lower it." And I got to meet my own replacement during my last 3 days of those 2 weeks. She wasn't even as tall as my chest. She literally had to get a stepladder to use that Satan box, in a busy kitchen with narrow walkways directly across from a large open deep fryer with people with less developed motor skills needing to pass through there. That was a massive accident waiting to happen. Oh, and speaking of accidents waiting to happen, one of the only other good cooks had epilepsy, and I literally thought I saw him die one day. He had a seizure online and collapsed. We were literally talking when it happened. He hit the ground, mouth started foaming, face turned purple. We yelled for help. Ambulance was called. His body had gone totally stiff. That was the same dude I found passed out after the Christmas party, so that's why when I found him limp on the ground, I had a moment wondering if he was dead. Absolutely terrifying, especially because he was working with grills and stovetops and deep fryers and knives all day. God only knows what would happen if he collided with any of those. Though an odd side note, this is the same pervy douchey guy. Well, I said he was a good cook, I didn't say he was a good person. And he recalls the story of how he got epilepsy, which I didn't know epilepsy was something that could be attained. But apparently there was another cook who had it, and he bullied that cook constantly for it, made fun of the way he talked and a bit of a stutter he had, and just was always on his case about it. And then that cook died from it. And as he says, 2 months later, the pervy chef started having seizures. And he says that it is his curse for being such a dick to him. So that was a little interesting to learn. Anyway, so now we get to the theory I mentioned at the start of this video. Now, this cannot be taken as truth or fact in any way. Huge disclaimer. This is all hearsay from someone who likes to gossip. And I don't know if they are always entirely honest when they gossip, due to the nature of what gossiping is. But it was someone who worked with the dad of the siblings who owned the place. According to what he told me, the pansy-ass coward's son begged his freshly retired daddy to buy him a restaurant, absolutely could not handle it, dragged his sister into it, and dragged his dad out of retirement for it. They were pissed at him. The sister hated it especially, and that's why she was such a complete cunt and liked to fuck over the workers. Because she hated that she had to work there, because of her idiot, coward brother. So, that's the end of today's story. There are still small things that popped up here and there while I was working in that kitchen that I might mention once in a while in other videos, but didn't feel like I could really fit into this video, especially since it would be random, short one-off tangents. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to my venting. If it was entertaining for you, or you found these struggles relatable, please consider leaving a like. And if you want to hear me ramble about more things I've done in my short 25 years of life, maybe subscribe. With that, I am out. Have a fantastic day, make good choices, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.